I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Canterbury in the Disaster Risk and Resilience team, and also at the University of Auckland as well in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. So I'm today going to be painting a picture of how the built environment might respond in a tsunami at different scales. I'm going to go through firstly, what are the damaging characteristics of a tsunami? So what is it about a tsunami that's causing this damage to the built environment? And then specifically, I'll go through tsunami impacts on buildings and then on Lifeline's infrastructure. I'm then going to look at, I've got a few slides from my NIWA colleagues on exposure here in Tairāwhiti, and I'm also going to finish on just challenges for response in this space. So there are four key damaging processes in a tsunami, and then a bonus one being fire, which is one of those secondary tsunami processes. So we have force, soil instability, debris effects, which has been talked about quite a bit today, and inundation as well. So I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. So wave force first is just the forces applied by the weight and the pressure of the water itself. So we have horizontal forces or hydrodynamic forces. These are a product of flow depth and flow velocity. So deeper water, faster flowing water is going to put more forces on structures that are interacting with that water. And then we have buoyancy forces, which is essentially vertical lifting. So it's when water gets underneath a structure or an object and pushes from below. We get situations with wharves, like in this picture here, bottom left, where it can compress air and blow the bottom of precast concrete floors out, similarly in buildings as well. Then we have soil instability. So the main one here is scour and erosion. So when fast-flowing water moves past an object, it becomes turbulent. So this picks up loose material in the soil. So if it's hitting a building, it's going to start scouring around foundations in particular. Around a bridge, it would be the abutments and the footings of the bridge. And a lesser known effect from tsunamis is also liquefaction. So you need quite a lot of water to do this, but the weight of the water can compress the top layers of the soil, and when that recedes, it can decompress that saturated soil and generate liquefaction, much like in a seismic event. And then we have debris effects. So this has already been talked about quite a bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but as Jose said earlier, it essentially becomes a bulldozing effect. So a real slurry of debris that just becomes compounding. The more debris in the tsunami, the more damage it's going to cause to other objects, which then become entrained in the flow. This is directly just collision damage. We also get damming. I think Jose mentioned that as well, where you have objects pressing up on other objects and it restricts the flow and it creates more pressure as that wave is still coming in and can collapse structures just from that alone. And litter is a huge problem after an event. So particularly for access, you can't get back into an area if there's a metre or so of debris across all the roads and rail potentially. And then we have inundation. So this is just effects from things getting wet. So this isn't too dissimilar to flooding impacts. So when water gets into structures, it, even at low levels, will buckle floors, like timber floors. It will absorb into absorbent wall linings, things like that, in terms of buildings. The difference being that this is going to be salt water. So you also have the effect of corrosion long term if you don't wash that off. Also contamination, so bacterial contamination, hazardous material contamination, that type of thing. And then fire as well, which is sort of a lesser thought about effect of a tsunami, but when we have a lot of this hazard material, particularly around ports, refineries, even gas mains in towns and cities, and a lot of broken up, dry, potentially debris floating on top of this tsunami, fires become a big problem very quickly, and we saw this a lot in Tohoku in particular, which is where these photos are from. There's also a very limited capacity to fight fires after a tsunami. As I mentioned, very restricted access potentially. The bottom right photo there is an oil refinery somewhere in Sendai area that burned for up to 4 days just because no one could get in there to put the fire out. You can see they're attacking it from the ocean, which is not safe to do just after a major tsunami because you've still got the waves coming in and out. Okay, so now I'm going to go through tsunami impacts on buildings specifically. So you can see in these examples here at different levels of damage. The bottom left is a wave that has, you can see, gone up to the top of the first floor, left that largely intact, whereas the structure itself is fine, whereas the bottom floor has had the windows blown out, all the internal walls, and it's gone straight through that structure. This is quite common. The bottom right photo is showing masonry walls that were perpendicular to the flow have been blown out. So these are unreinforced masonry walls, which isn't particularly common in New Zealand. Whereas the walls parallel to the flow, you can see, have resisted as the wave's going past it. And then the building on the top here, this is from Tohoku, you can see at every level there's a different level of damage. The bottom level has essentially had all of the internal walls and cladding on the exterior blown out. The first floor has had the exterior cladding blown off, but some of the internal structure is still there. And the top is starting to get damage to its external structure. In terms of vulnerability, the most vulnerable buildings to a tsunami are typically light timber framed structures, and this is pretty common here in Aotearoa for our residential buildings in particular. So these stand up pretty well to earthquakes, but perform relatively poorly in a tsunami. So that's because they are quite light and also buoyant, so they are often what is picked up first in terms of structures in a tsunami. And older buildings, so those that might be around a century or more older, aren't even necessarily attached to their foundations, so even small amounts of inundation can just lift those and float them away. Reinforced concrete buildings are typically quite resistant to tsunami effects as long as their walls actually are designed to blow out. So in Japan, some structures are designed to have the lower floors blow out in a tsunami so that the main superstructure stays intact as the water can just flow through it. And then in terms of masonry, so like I said, unreinforced masonry is quite susceptible to blowouts in a tsunami. Reinforced masonry will perform similar to reinforced concrete. And one thing I put here as a question is base isolation. So in Japan, they won't actually design buildings in a tsunami zone with base isolation because it's unknown how they perform. So that's just a bit of a question mark. We don't actually know how base isolated buildings perform, and we do have a number of them in New Zealand that would be in tsunami zones. So in lieu of an actual impact assessment, I've got these damage tables that are going to link hazard intensity to damage types that we might see. So you can see here at low flow depths, so less than half a metre, buildings are looking at just getting contamination, water damage like I mentioned, half a metre to 2 metres, scour around foundations, cladding starts to become detached, and debris strikes are quite common. And then once you get greater than 2 metres, this is where you start to get separation from the foundations, toppling of structures and structural walls blown out. So you can see there are a couple of examples here from Tohoku where a light timber frame building became buoyant and floated on top of the debris field and was deposited in situ. Whereas a reinforced concrete building actually resisted the flow of the tsunami to the point where it detached from its foundations but remained structurally intact, more or less. So we have an example recently from the 2016 Kaikoura tsunami. It's not widely reported, but there was one building damaged in this event in Little Pigeon Bay in Banks Peninsula. So this building had about half a metre to 1 metre of inundation, so not huge amounts of inundation, but still pretty considerable damage to the structure. There was, you can see walls blown out in the front, but the structure of the building itself remained largely intact. Pieces of the veranda and the deck floated away. The entire building lifted slightly and rotated on its chimney axis. So without that chimney, it probably would have floated away. So this is just one small data point, but it does show what could happen. And even if you take away the damage to the structure, just a huge amount of debris, a real mess. So bring it back to Tairāwhiti in terms of exposure. So this is some recent work done by NIWA looking at, and it was an exposure assessment at a national level using the evacuation zones around the country. So you can see where Tairāwhiti stands nationally there. In terms of building exposure, so there's so we've got 10,000 buildings, residential buildings exposed to within the yellow zone, including orange and red. There's 2 retirement homes, 483 commercial and 1,800 industrial buildings. There looks like 3 medical centres, like someone said, there's no hospital, 57 emergency management structures, There are also 160 government buildings, 11 infrastructure utility buildings, 220 education buildings, and over 6,000 other, which would be potentially garages, sheds, that type of thing. So this just gives an idea of the level of exposure for one of these really big local events. Cool, I'm going to go through Lifeline's infrastructure now. So what I'm talking about is the physical infrastructure of transportation, energy, three waters, and telecommunications. So infrastructure plays a pretty important role before events, during events, and after events. This has been touched on quite a bit today as well. So pre-event, we're talking hazard management, getting warnings out, and also evacuation, so bridges, roads, that type of thing. Post-event, habitability is a really important thing. So even if you have structures and shelter, do they have heating, sanitation, communication, that type of thing? And then recovery, like I said, access is a really key thing post-event. And then also economic effects that flow on from that. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few of these damage tables now, and I'll try and fly through them because they are a little bit tedious, but I am trying to link the hazard intensity to the level of damage we might see, and also give you an idea of the sort of spectrum of damage we see across all of these different infrastructure types. So firstly, for transportation, roads and bridges, at low flow velocities, it's really common to see silt deposited on roads and bridges. Tsunami silt is very fine. It can be very fine and quite hard to, you'll lose traction on it essentially. So a lot of that has to be cleared. We see superficial debris strikes, and ponding is a big problem. We start to see at 1/2 metre to 2 metres of inundation, peeling of pavement, scouring of the road, the sub material on the road, abutment erosion on bridges, scour of footings, light timber structures, so what would be common in a rural setting can be washed away at this level, and corrosion long term if it's not cleaned off. And then beyond 2 metres is where we start to see lifting of even concrete pavements, cracking of pavements as they're undermined by scour. In bridges, so we might see aggradation of waterways where the waterways themselves actually can't contain as much water afterwards because the channels have narrowed and potentially filled up. And separation of decks from the substructure and wash out of the structure entirely. Rail is not too dissimilar, so we'll start to see scour of ballast material at even low flow velocities. Once we get to about 1/2 metre to 2 metres, tracks that are on timber sleepers start to become buoyant, more so than other design. We will see separation of tracks from ballast, derailment of carriages at about this level. And then when we get to high levels, we'll see washout of the ballast itself and floating of carriages. And a really important thing to think about with rail, if you have passenger rail in particular, is evacuation routes along that rail line, which is not often considered. So ports and airports. So ports, seaports in particular, are usually in the firing line first for tsunamis just because of where they're located. So it's really typical at low levels to see scour around wharf foundations again. This is a common theme, the scour. So water damage to machinery, particularly electrical components, and vessel moorings, even at low inundation levels, can start to break their moorings and start floating around and causing damage to themselves and other vessels. We'll see debris deposited in waterways as the wave has receded once we get to a level where debris is picked up. This can be an issue for navigation and things like that. Debris strikes to vessels, shipping containers, logs, as we talked about before, and dangerous goods are usually stored at ports, so they can become a real big problem. We'll also see at higher levels, we can see changes to the port bathymetry. So with subsidence, that could change it, but also just the tsunami itself. Jose was showing some erosion models before. So these are things that would have to be thought about after the fact to make sure that your ships are still able to use their shipping lanes. We see separation of decks from piers, coastal protection structures are damaged, and vessels floated inland and or washed away. With airports, silt on the runway and debris, much like roads, is a big issue, and we see ponding. We start to see vehicles floated away after about 1/2 metre, debris strikes on planes and buildings, and over 2 metres you'll start to get planes physically washed away, and fuel tanks breached. Okay, so some exposure numbers for Tairāwhiti. So for roads, there are no national scale roads, but regional roads, so this is in terms of capacity, so regional capacity roads would be quite high capacity roads. You can see there's about 24 kilometres of roads exposed in the region. We have 16 and 60 respectively for arterial and primary collectors, so that's the next level down, so that would be like a main kind of urban road. We then have another almost 200 at the kind of suburban or rural level, 200 kilometres. In terms of railway, there's 17 kilometres exposed, and for airports, there's 1, which looks like it's in the yellow zone. And then again, you can see where Tairāwhiti stands at a national level. Okay, so moving on to the electrical network. So cables, we can see infiltration into electrical components from debris strikes or when insulation is pulled apart. Over half a metre, we start to see cables becoming stretched, scour of weak backfill material for buried cables, and cables under bridges are particularly susceptible. So any buried infrastructure, when it comes above the ground, that's where it's particularly vulnerable. Over 2 metres, we start to see cables severed and completely washed off poles. For utility poles, it's much the same. We have scour, shorting of electrical. For substations, much the same. When we get to medium levels, debris strikes, particularly outdoor components of substations and switch boxes, poles will become bent once they get about inundation becomes halfway up a pole, if it hasn't already been scoured out. We see debris strikes and scoured outdoor components. When you get above 2 metres, this is when poles, utility poles, so this includes cell phone towers and pylons as well, can be completely sheared or washed out, and buckling of lattice structures, which is like this one here, like a pylon. And then petroleum and gas. So petroleum pipes are very similar to the cables, so I won't go into that too much. Below ground, fairly resilient. Above ground, they're vulnerable. Gas storage and petrol storage. So tanks that are empty are particularly susceptible to buckling and floating. They can be fairly buoyant. If they're full, they will be more resistant to floating away, but also pose more of a hazard if they do breach. And water systems. So closed water systems, I won't go into them. Again, they're very similar to gas pipes and electrical cables. Below ground, fairly okay. Above ground, susceptible. One thing that is different is drainage pipes, so open channels. So this is what is designed to drain surface flow. So naturally, a tsunami is going to infiltrate these systems. You can see here in this photo, this is pretty common after a tsunami where drain intakes become clogged. The pipes themselves can become clogged with silt and debris, and it's fairly common after an event to, even a small event, to have to blast out the entire stormwater system from the outfall pipe. And another important point is culverts, so part of the stormwater network. Culverts running beneath roads or rail are particular weak points on the stormwater network and transportation network. When you have a lot of water rushing through a single pipe, it creates considerable force which can blow out the road entirely, and this is internationally where we see a lot of road washouts at that culvert. And lastly, I'm not going to go into the treatment and storage. That's very similar to the fuel tanks, but pump stations are similar to substations where outdoor components are particularly susceptible to damage, and interior components are less susceptible. And then lastly, I'll just do that, some exposure figures again from NIWA on built up versus production land. So within these evacuation zones, there's 14 kilometres squared of built up, so sort of urban or town settings, and 98 kilometres squared of production land. So it's another thing to consider is the amount of production land that is particularly vulnerable. When you have salt water inundating agricultural areas, it can kill off the crops or the grass. And you can see where Gisborne stands at a national level. So around 5% of all of the built up area in the country in the evacuation zones is in the region, and 4% for production. So some challenges for response. A lot of this has already been through today, which is awesome. So with infrastructure in particular, There are interdependencies. So, for example, the telecommunications network, fibre-based at least, is reliant on electricity. Electricity might be reliant on telecommunications for systems distribution and things like that. How is that going to affect the response and the recovery after an event like this? So this can lead to cascading or compounding impacts, essentially. So access, I've already been through, things like housing, sanitation, and critical facilities. So if you've lost some medical centres, rest homes, potentially shelters, EOCs, fire, police, how does that look after an event like this? And it was reassuring to see that there's the modular infrastructure that I saw that you guys have for response, which is awesome. And isolated communities. So isolated in terms of transportation, but also communication. So on the transportation side of things, so this here is a picture from the March flooding in Tokomaru Bay. What happens when every town looks like that? Every town has had a bridge damaged at the coastline. How does that change the response? And then there's also compounding hazards. So what if you have a storm after the tsunami and your stormwater systems are clogged up, your bathymetry, your rivers have all changed their shape, and obviously seismic events. So I've described damage in the context of a tsunami. I haven't even mentioned if there was earthquake damage or not. So it's just something to always consider. Cool, and I'm going to end it on that. I have a couple more slides on a case study, but I think I've been through this enough. I will just mention this. So this is just something to think about for your region. I've done an exercise with the Christchurch City Council where we looked at reduced access after a maximum credible event. You can see we end up with these red zones of complete isolation, essentially, by vehicular transport anyway, and just working through how they would respond, the roading teams, to an event like this. And essentially they decided they would have 4 crews, with 4 crews in front of those clearing debris, and they would work through systematically clearing the roads. We have one area that takes 44 days to get access to, one area that's 17 days, so still considerable, 20 days and 3 days. Cool, thanks.